Welcome to Leadenhall Consulting. Welcome to our third webinar in the series where we're looking at post-pandemic, the post-pandemic world. And I know we've been talking about this for some time now. We're all wishing that we were in the post-pandemic world, but this is the time to begin thinking and preparing and talking about it and beginning to plan. This time we're talking obviously about purpose, CSR and ESG. We've got three fantastic speakers, Suzanne, Scatliffe, Graham, Pewter and Annette Andrews. And obviously I'll introduce you to them when we get to that moment. Just a quick bit about Leadenhall Consulting. I know many of the people on here will be our clients or people who we know well. But this is our 10th year of operation. We were founded in 2011. We were very much a city firm at the beginning. We now have 45 coaches globally from the US through Europe and into Asia and Australia. Whilst we're mainly in financial services, particularly insurance and asset management, we also have clients in other sectors. And we've just launched a year ago Coaching on Demand, which is our online coaching portal, which we're very proud of and is growing very rapidly. And our coaching practice is led by Liz Codd, which is somebody that many of you will know. So that's the advertorial. It's all over. Here's the agenda for today. I'll be introducing the panel very shortly. I've got a few slides just to take you through to set the scene. We're hoping we get a good 15 to 20 minute question and answer after the speakers have spoken. And we should wrap up at 5:30. So we're trying to keep it to a punchy 1 hour session. I'm starting with Milton Friedman. And he's quite widely quoted as saying, there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in the activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud, which is a very narrow definition of what business should be. But it had and did for a while become, if you like, the main model by which the corporate world operated. And if you think of the 80s particularly, and the greed is good, in essence, the Milton Friedman model was full reign during that period with Reagan and Thatcher. And I'm not going to read this. You'll be very pleased to know I'm not going to read this, but this is a Business Roundtable statement that came out just before the pandemic. It was signed by 181 US CEOs, it was Jamie Dimon who was the face of this, but talking about the role of business. And whilst it's not a huge step away from the Friedman statement, you know, you're beginning to see things about stakeholders, about customers, about employees, about suppliers, about ethics, about supporting communities in which those businesses operate. And of course, generating long-term value for shareholders. And so capitalism is alive and kicking, but it is definitely moving towards a stakeholder model away from a pure shareholder model. Strikingly, in Larry Fink's 2021 letter to CEOs, and let's face it, BlackRock are an incredibly large investor and are very influential. He emphasized that they're looking at durable value, which includes capital management, you'd expect that, long-term strategy, purpose, and climate change. Yeah, he didn't cover the full CSR ESG mandate, but it's pretty clear that as an investor, they are interested in firms looking at these three things. And so before I introduce our first panel member, the questions I think we'd like to answer today, and I'm sure we will cover and people will talk about, is what do customers and clients want of companies in this area? What do employees want? What do investors want? And what do the businesses themselves want from corporate social responsibility, from a sense of purpose, and also their sustainable and environmental policies. So this is an incredibly important area. And we've just been through the pandemic. And there's evidence from people like Larry Fink speaking that actually this is going to be accelerated. It's not going to go away. It's almost as though the pandemic itself, as a major crisis, has made people think about the broader issues. And in fact, things like global warming and climate change may well become even more important over the next year or two than it already was. So that's kind of the introduction to the topic. Suzanne is going to speak first, and Suzanne is the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at AXA XL, and she leads the global CSR and sustainability strategy programs. She's got 16 years in this field, and she is Chair of the Board of Directors of the Insurance Industry Charitable Foundation, and volunteers as a Heart of the City mentor. So that gives you an idea of her background, both personally and corporately, and is going to talk to us about the CSR agenda. So if I can find Suzanne, if you could speak, Suzanne, we'll get you on screen.
Okay, great. I'm here. You ready for me to go, Chris?
That would be great.
Okay, great. All right. So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start with talking a little bit about what we mean by purpose to begin with. So last year, McKinsey published an article focused on the concept of companies with purpose. And they found that only 7% of Fortune 500 CEOs believe their companies should focus only on profits and not be distracted by social goals. Those who are purposeful see numerous benefits, according to McKinsey. So they'll see top line growth because they'll have a much more dependable customer base, cost reductions through energy efficiencies, talent attraction and retention, because we know that the employer of choice is one that's an effective corporate citizen. And general organizational resilience, because what we're seeing more and more is ESG, environmental, social, and governance matters are becoming mainstream. Shareholders expect their companies to be taking them seriously, as do the wider public. This is no longer a niche issue. So where to start? How do you become a purposeful company? Well, to begin with, I'd argue that the 7% of Fortune 500 CEOs might be approaching this in the wrong way if they are seeing social goals as entirely separate to making profits. I think CSR obviously has its roots in philanthropy, but focusing solely on philanthropic efforts nowadays is a very outdated way of working. If we look at CSR and sustainability leaders across industries, any industry, we'll see that their approach really is baked into everything they do. They consider it in their products and services, their direct operations, and throughout their value chain. And I think another thing that's really important to note is a sustainable approach can also promote innovation. So very recently, Mars developed a new irrigation system for rice cultivation, which not only reduces water consumption by 30%, but will also save the company up to $180 million. And there are numerous examples like these which show doing good and doing well go hand in hand. And this concept actually has now been coined as a concept. It's known as shared value. It's something that was developed by Michael Porter from Harvard Business School. And he believes that the competitiveness of the company and the health of the communities around it are mutually dependent. So recognizing and capitalizing on these connections is where Porter believes all businesses should be focusing their efforts. I think the pandemic really reinforces this notion too. So prosperous communities ultimately mean profitable companies. We can't operate a successful business without considering deeply, what are the needs outside of our office windows? What's going on in the neighborhoods of our customers or in the regions where our suppliers operate? That it's all intrinsically linked. So to talk a little bit now about what we do within AXA XL, and we've really strived to take a kind of shared value approach to our sustainability strategy by building goals and targets based on the most material ESG issues for our business. So in order to identify those, we conducted a series of stakeholder surveys and interviews, both internal and external stakeholders, to ask what are the most significant ESG issues for our business? What's going to make us successful? What's going to make us stable in the future? And so our program focuses really on driving both business and social and environmental value with those material issues in mind. And to keep us honest, we have a number of working groups across the business. So underwriting, claims, risk consulting, client management, they're all part of our day-to-day in terms of how we implement what we're doing. They help bring those local insights, those expertise, those, what are our clients and brokers talking about? What's the situation in the market? So we can make sure we keep our CSR relevant, but appropriate and fitting for our business as well. And sorry, my puppy has just woken up and has decided to play with his squeaky snake. So please let me know if the squeaky snake gets too distracting. The other thing I wanted to share is for us, this kind of stakeholder approach has been really useful in terms of looking externally as well. So we recently just set up a water advisory group, and that consists of our own clients, policymakers, academia, as well as colleagues from AXA XL. And they're really helping us develop initiatives which will serve our clients and our wider communities. They're co-creating solutions with us to help make the world more water resilient. Now, you might be wondering, why is a commercial insurance company concerned about water? So I will just explain a little bit about why we're focusing on that issue. So water actually came out as a priority issue in that stakeholder assessment I mentioned a moment ago. And water really is the primary medium through which we will feel the effects of climate change, which of course is a topic very relevant to our business, but to many, many others as well. And it's not just an environmental issue. So when we see water availability becoming more scarce, the impacts from a social perspective are numerous. We see poor health, interrupted education, gender inequalities, conflict, unreliable food production. The list is endless. So actually ensuring that everybody has access to water is really a critical component of mitigating climate change, but also addressing some very significant social issues. From an economic piece as well, McKinsey, again, recently estimated that 2/3 of businesses have substantial water-related risks, either in their direct operations or in their value chain. And of course, all industries rely on water to some degree. So we feel, as an insurer, this is a really important role we can play here in making sure we have a world that's more prepared for water-related risks. Finally, one point just in terms of the approach we're taking within AXA is I just wanted to reference the stance of the wider AXA group, which we're obviously part of. You may be aware that we have a series of exclusions in our underwriting practices, notably with respect to carbon intensive industries. I wanted to raise this because I think this obviously makes a strong environmental statement to say that we're no longer going to underwrite coal, but there are financial reasons that support this decision too. I think as the world moves away from fossil fuels, we obviously have this challenge of stranded assets. But ultimately, there is an argument that these industries are going to become unsustainable. I know I've just got a couple of minutes left. So just to close, I wanted to just share a little on what the future might look like. I think there's many studies that cite that sustainability policies reduce risk, which is obviously particularly relevant for the insurance industry, but also generally just promote faster growth. And when we think about social and environmental risks, they tend to manifest themselves over a longer term and typically, of course, are outside of a business's control. So actually, regardless of which industry you're in or how big your company is or where you operate, actually all companies need to build those capacity and adaptive strategies now in order to be future fit. So to close, really, I'd argue that that CSR and ESG drivers, which are obviously becoming more and more prevalent, are doing so for good reason, because they are going to be what drives a truly sustainable and purposeful business. I think I made it within my 10 minutes.
That is amazing. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for that. Okay, I'm just going to pin myself and unpin you, which is somewhere here. Okay. I'm now having a slight technical issue while I unpin. Whoops. Hold on, there we go. So thank you for that. Now we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, and I'm now going to introduce you to Annette Andrews. Annette was Chief People Officer for Lloyd's. She's had a career in human resources, which started at Ford Motor Company. Just a huge coincidence is that my first job at Ford was in the paint shop at Halewood in Liverpool, or in Merseyside. And as an industrial relations officer, well, about probably, I'm guessing, 10 years later, Annette ended up working as a graduate trainee doing the same job that I did 10 years before. So we actually have a common history in the Ford Motor Company. She's worked for the Lloyd's banking group, and she's worked for the Lloyd's insurance market, has an MBA. And I also know her in the capacity of Master of the Guild of Human Resources, which is a guild in London, obviously dedicated to building a livery company for the human resource profession. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing her profile, and I'm going to ask if Annette will speak.
Thank you, Chris. Well, hello, everybody. Lovely to see you. I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle to Suzanne. You'd think with my people background, I'm clearly going to talk about it from an employee, employer, but also community and customer perspective as well. So what a huge year of change. I think back, and every time I talk to somebody, it's like, what a journey we have been on. But that change has affected all of us. And what I wanted to do today was to share with you some of the insights I'm getting, and they're actually global, from individuals and organisations that I'm now working with on a coaching and consulting basis. And it's fascinating. There are really core themes that are coming through. So we've touched on it already, but the pandemic has resulted for many of us reconnecting with a number of things. One of them is our communities. That's where we live. Not necessarily where we've worked, but where we've lived. We've spent way more time than we previously have in our local communities. And it's really highlighted to us what's important, what's needed. And we'll want to keep that close and continue to add value. We'll also be looking to our employers to keep our local communities at the heart of what they do. So where our employers are based, the socio-economic environment they're working in, the local communities, employees want to be part of a rebuild. They want to be integrating it into all we do. So that's community work, socio-economic diversity, etc. No longer are work and our communities separate. They've come much closer together as a result of the pandemic. Equally, for an employer, for many of us, our employer has become an extension of our personal community. We're on Zoom today, and we've spent the last year on Zoom, and that has given us a snapshot and insight into our lives, way more than we ever did before. But actually, for many of us, it's been, tough, lonely, but equally we've had the puppy in the background. Suzanne, I can relate to the dog in the background, but also the family being very much part of our work life as well, because the two have been much more merged than previously. That has meant that our employer has got greater connection to our families and personal lives than ever before. And those connections need to be built on and developed further. For many people, that connection has helped keep them sane. And I'll be very honest, there have been organisations where they haven't kept up that feeling of community and relationships, and that has damaged their relationship with their employees. But where that additional support has been provided to individuals through social events, network, informal support, both to them and their families, that has really built a connection and engagement. There's greater respect and value for work-life balance now, way more than ever before. People now know what they value and also what they didn't have before. And that reconnection with families, for example, is something that people want to retain. They have, if you like, reprioritized what's important to them. And it's something that organisations will need to continue to think about, is how they can continue to grow and develop that employee community feeling, particularly as we're now starting to talk about this hybrid working environment where we'll be a bit of home and work with, and potentially You know, we're wanting to keep those connections going in all of those environments. One thing for employers to think about, employees won't just think about benefits for themselves anymore. They will think about the benefits that are on offer for the whole family. Well-being being an important one, for example. What is available that my family can access, not just me? Our values. This has been a unique experience, and let's be honest, it's affected us all, but it's not going to magically disappear overnight. We can see it's all happening at different places in different parts of the world. We know already that the long-term implications and impact is going to be far-reaching. So we need to think about that and how we can support people ongoing. But it's affected us all in many ways, but it's also really highlighted for us the fragility of life and what's important, but also particularly the fragility of the environments that we all live in and those that we work within. People are not prepared to work and live in the same way as they did before. They're also looking to their employers to lead on this and to continue respecting that new balance and values that they have. It's also made us all really reflect on, do we want to work this way? What do we want to do? Do we want a different balance? Are we prepared to commute anymore? Do we want to move somewhere else? What's the working environment that we want to live in? And so there need to be ongoing discussions about that. So as a result, employers will need to have a very clear purpose that is well communicated. This bit's really important now. It needs to be measurable. There is some commentary out there that there's been a lot of talk, but we want to see the action. We want to see the deliverables. What are people actually doing? There's also been some discussion about organisations have tried to spread themselves too thin and talk about too much. Let's narrow it down and some focus on some very key areas. Suzanne, you talked about water being one of the priorities. Well, let's really make sure we know what our priorities are and then show real progress against those. But also, employees want to feel that their employer is accountable for delivering against that. So being very open about the objectives and the progress made. So going forward, this will really support recruitment. So the talent of the future get a very different education at school and university about the environment, the community, and what's important. Their value base is very different. Their knowledge is much wider. They come in with very different expectations. Just to give you a scary example, my 22-year-old son reads from back to front the annual reports of the companies he's looking to go and work for. And he looks as a priority as to what they are doing in their communities and what they're delivering against the environmental commitments they've made, and also on diversity and inclusion. If he's comfortable what they're doing and that they're delivering, he will then express more interest in them. So I certainly didn't approach it that way. I was more interested in the pay and benefits, then looked at those things. So it's completely flipped it round. So retention is also going to be important. If you talk to the recruiters out there at the moment, they will tell you that people are actively looking. The market has absolutely picked up for recruitment, and people are now basing some of their decisions to move based on their experiences and reassessment of what's important during this period of pandemic. So it's something to think about from a retention perspective as well. Also, we talk about purpose creates a sense of belonging, it creates trust. All of those things are really important for engagement, but also to develop a high performance culture. And at the end of the day, we all want to maintain and enhance an internal and external brand profile. So to conclude, I'd leave a couple of key messages, which is the psychological contract has changed with employees and their employers, but also it's changed with employers and the communities they serve. There are different expectations now. There's a real opportunity to change and embrace those changing needs. Hybrid working model is a really good example of where change can bring benefits for employee, company, family, the environment, the communities. So it's thinking about the hot topics and how can they be shared both internally and externally to really think about embracing local communities, but also environmental change, etc. And that will be a key differentiator that will be important to customers and shareholders going forward. Thank you very much. And to move on to back to Chris and then to Graham.
Thank you very much, Annette. So that's the employee perception. We're now going to move on to Graham Pewter. And Graham is chair of a company called Muuvment. I can't spell it correctly yet, but it's something like Muuvment or something like that.
You got it right.
I sometimes put an E in it. The business is looking at how to support individuals within businesses in respect of corporate and personal and social responsibility. So it's an interesting business. And so Graham is giving a solution, I suppose, to a certain extent to this issue, but is coming at a very different angle from this. So I'm going to just do a quick slide share and give you his background. So Graham's chairman of Muuvment. He's had 40 years in the international reinsurance market. He has the good fortune of living in Bermuda, hence the palm trees in the background, and is still an independent director on a number of boards, both profit firms and non-profit boards. So I'm going to hand over to you, Graham, and I think you're going to enjoy what Graham has to say. He's got a very interesting background and a very interesting proposition.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the webinar. I'm definitely not going to spend the next 10 minutes doing a shout out for what Muuvment is doing as a company. I may mention a few things at the end when I conclude, but what I wanted to do was, in fact, pull together some of the themes that Suzanne and Annette have articulated during their comments, and just a few observations on top of that as well. And it seems that there are two major and related trends going through the corporate world at the moment, and the first involves the post-COVID reassessment of the nature of work itself and a company's relationship with its employees. Because remote working brings some pretty complex challenges that companies have to confront. I remember, last April, May, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal quite prominently saying that the expectation was that remote working would have a very negative impact on employee engagement and would create some very serious challenges, and particularly around how to maintain a sense of community, how to support corporate culture. So the question was, what impact does remote work have on employee engagement? These early assessments was that they will be very negative. And in fact, in this week's Economist, there's an article that suggests the reverse. A survey from MIT suggesting that actually employees now feel, because their employers have been obligated to reach out in a more organized way, that in fact it's had a positive impact on engagement. So I think the jury's out on exactly what the consequences are. And regardless, the situation is very fast moving, but one thing that's certain is that there are some major health issues to be dealt with, especially around mental health. For some of us working from home with access to desk and the proper resources, it might have been a pleasure and a relief from the commute. For other people that might be alone in a small apartment with no balcony in a high rise, whose lives were very much concentrated around their work colleagues, clearly this is a very, very different issue. And as Annette mentioned, companies are rethinking their obligations to employees and their families and their communities. So that's an interesting one to watch. The second trend, of course, is the shift toward ESG strategies and defining a company's social purpose. And this response is coming from stakeholders, from investors, from customers, from employees. And the challenge for companies is to reconcile the profit and loss account with making a positive social impact. and actually to think about whether social capital is as important, or will be as important, as financial capital and human capital for that matter. So with the social in ESG applying to employees as much as external stakeholders, employees want to work for companies that are more authentically values-based. And I think authenticity is really, really important factor in how companies are reshaping themselves. And it needs to be fully supported by data that companies with a clear articulation of their values do enjoy higher levels of employee engagement. So in the corporate world, the concept of corporate social responsibility is evolving into social purpose. And these are more than vague platitudes, because for many companies, CSR has been very narrowly defined. It's been linked to charitable giving, and it's been linked to the related communications. So it's been somewhat tactical. But social purpose isn't a mission statement and a set of values and a charitable budget. It's central to a business model, and it's driven from boards, and it informs strategic decisions. There's one writer and speaker, Simon Sinek, who I'm sure most of you have heard of, who delivered, I think, the second most popular TED Talk of all time on corporate strategy and finding your why. And his theory is that customers care less about what you do and how you do it. They care about why you exist. What's your purpose? And that's really what we've all been driving at today. That purpose itself brings social capital, because if social capital is a shared set of values that allows stakeholders to work together in networks to achieve a common purpose, then that is exactly, you can see how important that would be. And arguably, as I said earlier, the building and managing of social capital is as important to corporate success as human and financial capital. I mean, it builds customer loyalty and brand identity. And it's a very powerful tool for attracting and retaining staff. So ESG is becoming mainstream to corporate strategy. In recent years, there's been more focus on the E and the G. The S perhaps has been more elusive because it's less tangible, and it's harder to develop KPIs and specific performance measures, although I think they're coming. But there's no doubt that where companies have a strong and shared culture across the organization, the S practices tend to be strong, and the converse is, of course, true. Companies are at very different stages in this journey towards social purpose, and it's difficult to compare companies of different size and scale, of course. But one interesting insurance industry survey that was released in the fourth quarter of last year by an online publication called Artemis revealed some interesting statistics. The survey involved 41 insurers and ILS managers, and of those, 95% agree that an integrated ESG strategy is critical to their future success. At the same time, 87% said they have no defined ESG strategy, or if they do, they believe it to be ineffective, which is quite a startling statement as to where the insurance sector, not to pick on them, but it's interesting that there's work to be done at a sector level. But there are, of course, companies who have taken a leading role, which is enhancing to the reputations. And AXA XL is a great example of a company taking a leadership position. Suzanne, it really is true. It's you guys do great work. Another company in Bermuda, actually, that is a sector leader in this trend is Renaissance Re, who recently published a set of ESG principles, which I would encourage everyone to read. It was very powerfully articulated. And their chief risk officer said, basically, and I'll quote him, that if insurers or any companies fail to see the value in embracing ESG, they're going to be left behind because public expectations are changing. And investors and regulators are raising expectations. There's a shift in public sentiment. People are assessing what they value. And if companies aren't taking that seriously, they're going to struggle to succeed. And in fact, going back to Larry Fink, they may struggle to raise capital. So we're now seeing more companies establish or appointing a C-suite executive whose sole responsibility is for ESG matters, sometimes called the Chief Sustainability Officer, although there seems to be many variations of the title, but it's interesting that these are C-suite appointments. And clearly the speed with which that's going through companies depends on their size as well. Now, where does Muuvment fit into this picture? We're a social impact software company, and we assist companies to more effectively communicate their ESG mandates to their teams via interactive video, supported by individual and teams-based actions that produces critically important impact data for management reporting. We've talked to a large number of companies in many verticals who recognize the needs to incorporate social impact into their business, but don't really know how to go about it and how to communicate it. But there's a clear correlation between an employee's view of a company's values and their level of engagement. And a well-articulated and well-communicated social purpose has a positive effect on employee recruitment. And that's important in the battle for talent, for human talent. Millennials and Gen Zs want to work for ethical, values-based companies. They're also far more receptive to messaging delivered via video, and that's really where Muuvment come from. Measurable impact data with messaging driven through interactive video. We think that more authentically engaged companies will lead to more engaged teams, and that will lead to a better world at the margin. And that's probably the goal for everybody on this call and everywhere. So that's it from me, Chris. I just tried to pull everything together, and hopefully we'll have some Q's and A's to respond to in the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
I think you're on mute, Chris.
Yes, I'm on mute.
There you go.
So when we get to editing the video, I will point out to our video editor to take that bit out. And I'm experimenting right now because what I'm trying to do is to put the speakers all on the screen. So we have the panel together. So we're now open for questions. So you can either put those questions via chat or you can be brave and ask a question personally, and we'll do our best to answer it. So questions to our panelists.
I have a question. Can you hear me, Chris?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, this is more of a sort of a navel gazing question, I guess, for any of the three, which is, what sort of timelines do you think we are now working towards around this agenda for ESG? I know certain organisations are starting out, some are obviously very far behind, but there's obviously a measure of urgency around it. What are we talking about, 3 years, a year, 5 years?
I think it depends on the size and complexity of the business, because AXA Group have 300,000 people, I suspect, and significant resources and significant reach. And so the ability to drive a leadership position through is very different than a private business with 1,000 people, but the imperative is still there. So I think it is to some degree a question of resources.
I think I would add to that and go, I think it starts small, think big, and not overcomplicate it. It's more important to get started on that journey and start to communicate it and share it and do a build model than it is to wait for a couple of years to do something huge that you've spent years developing. Because people are looking now for something that they can engage with and relate to. That's both internally and externally.
I guess
oh, sorry, Suzanne.
I was just going to add, I'd actually turn the question inwards and say, you know, why are you doing it, and how urgent is the action on your side? You know, if it's to future-proof the business, if you're in an industry where actually, as the world moves to a lower carbon economy, does that change your fundamental business model? Then obviously it's very urgent. You know, if it's more about thinking about bringing in the next generation of talent, maybe you have a couple of years to address that and, you know, get your house in order to attract that generation. But I think it, you know, it shouldn't be an adjunct. It should be part of your core business. So actually, you know, doing an inwards look of actually how organizationally resilient are you today compared to the ESG agenda, and what do you need to change in order to become more resilient, I think will answer the question of then how urgent is that action. But
it might also be pushed very quickly by external stakeholders, because if your capital providers are threatening to disinvest, and the millennials and the Gen Zs that will make up 75% of the workforce by 2030 will refuse to work for a company unless they share values, and that goes to Annette's comment about your son, I think. That's a trend that's inescapable. And so it actually it'll push companies to take action, perhaps even if they're more cynically internally thinking and just feel as though that they are being reluctantly pushed along this path. It's an imperative, so there's no choice.
I'm guessing that things like CSR and D&I will be scooped along with it and become part of this bigger or holistic intention.
Yeah. In fact, it was suggested that the S in ESG should be stakeholder and not social, because that's a more, I think it was the Harvard Business Review said that it's maybe a more appropriate way of looking at the S in ESG.
Any other questions?
I have a question if you can all hear me.
Yep, we can.
Thank you first of all, because I found it really insightful. So thank you for all your insights. I'm actually undergoing a CSR project with a fashion retailer at the moment, but they're currently loss-making, and they have been for the last few years. And the pushback I'm getting from the board is value creation is a long-term goal, but what value are they going to find in short-term CSR policies? So I didn't know if any of the panelists had any input, certainly to help me get some funding going for CSR activities. Thank you.
So I guess I think this is a classic challenge of, you know, short-term profits versus long-term view and long-term relevance of an organisation. But I think sometimes it can be the way that the board or your execs or your influencers perceive CSR. So again, it shouldn't be something extrinsic to the day-to-day of the business. And I think sometimes it's just understanding the common language you need to speak to shift that CSR agenda. You know, whether that's kind of sitting down with the board and understanding what, or your execs and understanding what are their priorities for the next 12 months, 3 years, 5 years, whatever's the appropriate time frame, and then helping them connect those priorities with actually how CSR and sustainability topics can support that agenda. Because it can, it's just sometimes, you know, as a CSR professional, you need to be a bit of a dot connector as much as anything else.
That's funny. I was going to say that as well. It's all about helping people join the dots up, and it's upskilling people to understand that the dots can be connected and should be.
And presumably there are also, a couple of short, I mean, I think, Suzanne, you gave some good examples of actually cost savings that were made pretty quickly by making decisions that were both on the social agenda, but equally were just practical and saved huge costs. So, there will be short-term wins for any business if you look for them. Plus, there's the other risk, of course, particularly in the sector you've just mentioned, where if you are taking suppliers who are not treating their workers well, or are using water, that's not available in a particular environment. There's that classic example of water being used for cotton, etc., that's literally drained huge lakes of water because of the activity, that kind of stuff, that there could be a PR disaster, and a PR disaster could literally sink a business. And we saw what happened to Boohoo recently. So there are examples where if you don't get on the agenda pretty quickly, you're taking quite a big risk with public relations and a relationship with your customers.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I can just add to something else to look at is Patagonia. Actually would be a really great case study for you looking in fashion. Patagonia are a real CSR leader, across the board, but they've done some very bold things. So, for example, back in 2011, around Black Friday, they had a huge ad with a picture of a jacket, and it said, "Don't buy this jacket." And basically, they took a very anti-Black Friday stance, a very anti-fast fashion and kind of disposable, consumable approach. And instead, what they reinforced was that actually, if you buy from Patagonia, that you can bring in your torn jacket and they will repair it for you, or they will recycle it. And actually, as a result of that campaign saying, please don't come into our shops and buy things, the following year, their revenue increased by 30%. So there are some really good examples that you can maybe draw upon within fashion that have actually taken a really strong CSR stance and have seen it pay off from a financial perspective.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate those comments. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Thanks for the opportunity to ask. So how receptive do the speakers find that CEOs are to the idea of the internal shifts that they will have to make and their companies will have to make in order to respond? And how do they get to the next stage? That I'd be interested to know how that works from your perspective, having seen it so close up.
I think from having talked to a number of CEOs, and my background is in the insurance sector, so I can only speak to that. But the insurance business, for example, is a very cyclical one, and we go through spells of mergers and acquisitions and consolidation, and then new companies setting up. The last few years has seen both consolidation and a number of new companies come into the business. Then CEOs are faced with similar but quite different challenges. For a newcomer, a company has to somehow articulate a set of values. Financial capital is not a differentiator in the insurance sector. If you don't have $1 billion, you're not really in the game. Therefore, what makes you unique? Some companies are telling a story around technology and data science. Other companies are saying that they have a different approach to their relationship with their people. Whatever it is, they have to quite quickly try and identify a set of values that are more than just platitudes, that are something that potential employees will be willing to accept and buy into. So I think that's one set of situations. There's others where companies perhaps have had a change of control, where teams are somewhat beaten down, where there's a problem with morale, again, where a company has to be seen to re-energize and to redefine what the company stands for. So there's two different circumstances where CEOs are pushing management to move quite quickly on this level of articulation of purpose, because it's an expediency to drive their success going forward.
Any other comments on that? There's also a question in chat, which I'll ask in a second. Does that answer your question, or would you like any other comments on that? Or would anyone else like to comment on the CEO element of this this challenge?
I think I'm interested to know how quick CEOs are to take up inputs for them personally, if they know they've got to make a huge internal shift. So some won't know, but some will. And I'd just be interested in how quickly, I'm sure there's a range across the board, but when you care about purpose, and you've always cared about purpose, it's interesting that the whole that organisations have now really got to engage with purpose. So is it exec coaches who get alongside them who are more holistic? Is it other inputs? Do they sort of, you know, let it be let others in the company run for it and not really run with it and not really engage? Yeah, I'm just interested in all those dynamics, really.
And Rachel, sorry, just to say, you're right, there's a huge variety of views and experience. Honestly, I don't think it can really work or be embedded if you haven't got that CEO personal interest and support. And quite often it's a combination of the ask of the customer, the board, the stakeholders, the funding, but it's equally, you know, sitting down and going through all the internal, external reasons as to why this is a good thing, the difference it could make, doing the business case for all the values thing. But often it's about finding that one carrot, whatever it might be, that really appeals to them, and it just makes that engagement happen. But it can be challenging to find that one little carrot that works, and then the rest falls in place. But coaching is a great way of doing it.
Thanks.
The one thing I was just going to add, and I was going to talk from personal experience, and I'm actually going back multi-years to the 2000s, where I used to work with the CEO, and at least one person on this call used to work with me in that organization. And it was an insurance firm. And for a while, in fact, and this is over 10 years ago, the organization was very committed in a number of areas to CSR. They had a fantastic way of raising money for various good causes. The staff were more engaged than I've ever seen in any organization. There was also a statement of values which people used to quote to each other. And for a while, I think the organization was in a very good place. And the CEO had driven that from when he set up the company. Sadly, the CEO, in my view, moved away from those values, and it actually led to a period of stagnation, high turnover, and deep cynicism. And that company still exists, but is now having to be rescued and reinvigorated. And so, you know, it's not linear. It's not as though sometimes people think civilization is just on one journey to this nirvana, and is, you know, that we can't have setbacks. Well, you know, organizations have setbacks. And I saw an organization 10 years ago that, if you were looking at it today, would be a great example of good CSR, good engagement, and good values. But it all went horribly wrong. And so certainly if a CEO commits to this, which they have to keep at it. And it's not a 2 or 3 year journey. And they mustn't be tempted to start to go back to another method of behavior, because the impact of that on the business, in my view, is disastrous. So the CEO has to commit, and then they have to commit long term. Because,
you know, Chris, it's not a top-down exercise. That's one true. Of the issues is that the CEO is a cult of personality, and the CEO says, I care about clean oceans, or I care about clear water, and that drives the CSR mandates. It's far more authentic when it's more democratized, and teams have an ability to contribute to a debate over what those, let's take the UN SDGs, so there's 17 of them. It's far better to engage, if management have the confidence to engage their teams in that debate over what matters the most, and then act on that. That requires a bravery in the C-suite that a lot of companies won't do, but the enlightened ones and the successful ones will find that this is very much bottom up, and that's where you get a much higher level of engagement and pride.
Now, here's a question that I'm going to read out from Martin, which is: there's a danger that a company will focus on a small thing that they can quickly make a real difference on, while their core business is still perceived as destructive. Can you speak to the importance of communicating a recognition of the fact that a lot of change is needed, and no company can solve all of their own issues right away? A good example would be Shell, an oil company that's investing heavily in renewables. So, you know, what's people's response to that issue? That whilst they're doing good things, you know, their core business in this case is oil. What's people's thoughts on that question?
I'm happy to start. I think it's a really good question. It's a difficult one to reconcile, and I think some companies aren't doing it well. And what that means is that the good that they're doing, that they've chosen maybe an inappropriate focus given the realities of their business, and so they come across as inconsistent or hypocritical. And Shell in particular actually very recently did a disastrous Twitter campaign where they asked the Twitterverse what users would do to reduce their carbon footprint. I mean, it was so tone deaf. And actually, I think even there were US senators complaining very vocally about the fact that they'd chosen to do this, and just absolutely disastrous from a PR perspective. I think, in terms of a business that has a kind of fundamentally environmentally destructive nature, I think that the challenge is finding a path forward that is more environmentally but also socially just, and sometimes the two can actually be a little bit at odds. So a positive environmental action sometimes can have a negative social consequence. So to give you a very sort of basic example of that, I don't think anybody would argue that deforestation is a good thing, but actually if we think about those communities who are relying on logging legally or illegally to maintain their livelihoods, that takes a slightly more complicated stance. And actually, if you're an organization that's needing to pull back from deforestation activities, your responsibility is not only on the environmental side, but actually to say, we need to ensure this community who's going to be negatively impacted by this has the opportunity of a diversified income or the opportunity to be reskilled so that they can sustain a livelihood that has less of an environmental impact. So I'd say it's a tricky one, but I think it's one that businesses have a fundamental responsibility to figure out a pathway forward. It's just the general public, I think, need to also have a little bit of patience in realizing that these issues can be complicated, and that both the environmental and social side need to be considered before bold change is made.
And I think there's deep suspicion of government's role and ability to do the right thing, which is putting more pressure on large and influential companies to be more actively engaged.
Okay, look, we've used up our time. I'd like, first of all, to thank the panel for speaking, for answering your questions. Thank you for coming along. I hope you found it a good and interesting conversation. I do have just one final slide, which I thought I would just share with you before ending the thing. So if you just hold on one second. So I thought I'd end on this point, which is, again, a Larry Fink quote. Purpose is not merely a tagline or a marketing campaign. It's a company's fundamental reason for being, what it does every day to create value for stakeholders. Profits are in no way inconsistent with purpose. In fact, profits and purpose are inextricably linked. When a company truly understands and expresses its purpose, its functions with the focus and strategic discipline that drive long-term profitability. And I think sometimes I think these discussions or these debates get very focused on somehow these activities are a cost and don't add value or are not part of being a successful enterprise. But actually, I think in the post-pandemic world, increasingly it will be shown that organizations that do these things will actually be more successful. And certainly the McKinsey study and some of the other studies out there are beginning to show that organizations that are on the leading edge of these activities are actually going to be the successful companies, not the laggards. And so hopefully you've found that interesting, that's added some value. And thank you very much for coming along today. And thank you very much to our three speakers, Graham, Annette, and Suzanne. So thank you very much. Take care, everyone.